From Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, I'm David Weston. Welcome to Balance of Power, where the world of politics meets the world of business. On the brief today, Rishad Salamat from Hong Kong for the latest on the spread of COVID-19 in China. From Milan, Gerald Colton on what the virus is doing to northern Italy. And Tom Orlick from Washington on a global economy coming to terms with a virus that appears to be out of control. So, Rishad, thank you so much for joining us from Hong Kong. Give us a sense of what's going on in China, and let me be very specific. Is there a quarantine in Wuhan or not? Because I've heard conflicting reports.
David, what we have is a situation where people who are non-residents of Wuhan would have been allowed to leave the city. Don't forget, it's under lockdown, provided they weren't showing any symptoms. However, that order was rescinded shortly afterwards. So at the moment, it seems as if it is in lockdown along with the neighboring cities in Hubei province, which account for about 50 million people, where the death toll continues to mount more than anywhere else. As you've been saying, we've got the virus also spreading around the world. The WHO, the World Health Organization, saying it's not a pandemic, but saying that it is deeply worrying. Now, before we came on air, I was looking at the definition of an epidemic and a pandemic. An epidemic perhaps affects a few communities, a few regions, but a pandemic is something which goes global. We've got cases in Italy. You'll be reporting on that shortly. We've got cases in Iran, Bahrain, Kuwait now as well, to over 12 dead now in Iran itself. So is it a pandemic? It seems to certainly at the moment fulfill that particular criteria or definition.
And Rishad, specifically, what is the risk posed to Beijing? Because they've postponed, as I understand it, the Congress there. And the language coming out of the conference call that was held by President Xi suggested that he's really concerned about maybe Beijing having to shut down.
Well, indeed. I mean, 170,000 people apparently on that conference call as well, and some of the details coming out. The fear is, though, does China revert to type? Does President Xi Jinping now consolidate power after this? This is actually the question which is being asked by a lot of people. Does he use that as an excuse? We've already seen him grab power, if you will, with reducing his second term, i.e. he has unlimited terms here as well. But I just want to really get to what's going on on the streets of Hong Kong, for instance. I mean, of course, it's just gone 1 o'clock in the morning and there's very quiet out there as well. But there is an eerie sort of calm, if you will. And when we look at what's been going on with the financial markets, I mean, we've seen what's been going on with European stocks. We've had the biggest fall for them since 2016. It's almost as though this, for market participants, has just got real.
Exactly. Coming to terms with it finally. Very well said, Rishad. Terrific reporting from Hong Kong. Thank you very much at 1 o'clock in the morning your time. That's Rishad Salamat. And now let's go to Gerald Colton in Milan, our colleague there. And one of the concerns, I think, affecting the markets now is the spread to northern Italy, which is so terribly important to the Italian economy. Explain to us what the Italian government is doing in northern Italy.
Hello, good afternoon from Milan. Well, the government here, particularly the regional governments, are taking kind of a two-strand approach to the issue. There are a number of towns just to the south of here, around the city of Lodi, that are virtually locked down, closed. Some 50,000 people who live in that area are not able to leave, and people are not able to get in. Non-essential services have come to a halt in that area, and there is a law enforcement presence enforcing the cordon around that area. Now, in the rest of northern Italy, communities have taken measures such as canceling sporting events, canceling cultural events, moving to close bars and restaurants after a certain hour. So the approach of the governments across northern Italy has been to limit contact between people as much as possible.
And expand that out, if you would, for us. What does it mean potentially to free movement of goods within the European Union more generally? May we actually see some borders closed?
I certainly hope not. There hasn't been any indication of that happening quite yet. Although there have been some cases, some isolated cases of authorities in other countries, Austria, France, taking action to stop individual trains and buses crossing borders to check to be sure that infected people aren't on board. But there hasn't been any word on large-scale border closures or anything of that nature.
Okay, Gerald, thank you so much for reporting today from Milan. That's our colleague, Gerald Colton. And now we go to Washington. Tom Orlick will give us perspective more globally about the economic consequences of this COVID-19. What do we know? What do the economists think we know at this point, Tom?
So at this point, David, of course, we're still dealing with a significant amount of uncertainty, but there's a couple of points I would make. So the first is that a severe blow to China's first quarter GDP growth now appears a virtual certainty. And it's also striking, if you look at forecasts coming in from the street, they're coming down and down. So at the end of January, people were talking about maybe 4.5% year-on-year growth in the first quarter for China. That would already be a record low. It would mean zero growth in sequential quarter-on-quarter terms. If you look at the latest numbers coming in, they're pointing to growth in the 2 to 3% range in the first quarter, even lower than people were thinking a few weeks ago, and pointing to around a 2% contraction measured in sequential terms. The second point I would make is that until a few days ago, I think economists were really thinking about a blow to China and then spillovers from weaker Chinese demand and stalled Chinese supply chains to the rest of the world. But now, as you heard from some of our colleagues in Hong Kong and Italy, there's actually significant concern about outbreaks in other countries. Outbreaks in Italy, outbreaks in Korea. And what that means, if that happens, and of course we very much hope it doesn't, is that the rest of the world isn't just going to suffer from weakness in China in the first quarter, they're also going to suffer as their own factories get closed down by their own outbreaks.
And Tom, it strikes me one of the problems here is I'm not sure we have a model because we have a more globalized world than we've ever had in this sort of setting before. We don't know what this does to supply chains throughout the world because we're more interdependent than perhaps ever at any time in history.
Yeah, that's completely right, David. If you go back to 2003, when we had that SARS outbreak, China was around 5% of exports of global manufacturing inputs, the components which factories around the world need to finish their products. 2020, as we face this coronavirus outbreak, China now accounts for 20% of global exports of manufacturing components. So the risk of a virus in one particular place, especially in China, having those severe global impacts is just much more significant now than it was 20 years ago. And I think you put it well, this is a kind of a litmus test for the capacity of a global economy to show resilience in the face of this kind of outbreak.
Okay, Tom, thank you so much for reporting. That's Tom Orlik, our colleague from Bloomberg Economics, reporting from Washington. And now it's time to get check on the markets, and I don't have to ask today Abigail Doolittle about what the effect of what we're talking about is having on the markets. It's remarkable.
Yeah, we're really looking at a brutal sell-off for risk assets. Stocks here in the U.S. right now on pace for the worst day since December of 2018. That, of course, was that horrible fourth quarter volatility. So that's the degree of the selling pressure we're seeing. Bonds rallying at the lows for the 10-year yield. The best day for bonds going back to June of 2016. That, of course, was the Brexit haven bid. That's the degree of haven buying we're seeing. The yen is finally up about 1%, the best day since August. All of this is investors are really saying to themselves, this is not SARS. A week or two ago, a lot of folks were betting on the idea that this would go away quickly. It's simply unknown. We don't know what the impact is going to be on the global economy. Will it extend beyond a quarter or two?
And it strikes me, Abigail, this is quite different from December of 2018 because that, we said at the time, what's causing this? It's not clear what's causing it. This time we know what's causing it and we don't know when it ends.
Exactly. It's infinite in terms of the possibility for tragedy, unfortunately, since doctors and physicians don't really quite know how it's being spread. But if it continues to spread and continues to force various companies to shut down manufacturing, shut down operations, it will continue to eat into the corporate profit outlook. At the end of the day, that is what stocks trade off of. So we've talked many times over the last number of months, because on the trade war, we had lots of headline volatility. That really never affected the corporate profit outlook. That's why you saw stocks bounce back. In this case, we really could see the corporate profit outlook hit in a significant way. In that case, stocks should come back to earth for much more of a sane valuation. Also, there's been so much FOMO, or fear of missing out buying. A lot of these indexes are so far above their moving averages. The FANG index, the big tech index, had been 40% above its 200-day moving average, telling you how overextended. But that was on falling momentum, which typically tells you there's going to be some sort of crash to earth similar to what we're seeing today.
Okay, thank you so much. We'll keep you apprised of the markets as they develop. And Abigail will be right here to do that for us. In the meantime, we're going to turn turn now to Mark Crumpton for Bloomberg First Word News.
David, former movie mogul Harvey Weinstein has been convicted of rape. A jury here in New York City found Weinstein guilty of rape and a criminal sexual act, but acquitted him on the most serious charge of predatory sexual assault. On Friday, jurors signaled they were having trouble reaching a verdict on that charge. Weinstein still faces sexual assault charges in Los Angeles. They were announced the day his New York trial started. Like millions of tourists who come to India, President Trump and his wife Melania visited the Taj Mahal. The president called the 17th century white marble mausoleum, quote, truly incredible. Earlier, the president began his trip by saying the U.S. will sign military deals with India worth $3 billion. He spoke at a cricket stadium filled with about 100,000 people. The White House is getting ready to respond to an urgent budget request to address the deadly coronavirus outbreak. The Department of Health and Human Services has already tapped into an emergency infectious disease rapid response fund and is seeking to transfer more than $130 million from other HHS accounts to combat the virus, but is pressing for more. A White House official says a response could come this week. In Germany, police say dozens of people are injured, several seriously, after a car slammed into a crowd at a Carnival parade. The driver was arrested, and German police say they believe he deliberately rammed his vehicle into the procession. It happened about 175 miles southwest of Berlin. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and at Quick Take on Bloomberg, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thanks so much, Mark. Coming up, Nevada is in the rearview mirror with South Carolina looming. We talk with our political panel about Bernie Sanders on a roll. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio.
In Nevada, we have just put together a multi-generational, multi-racial coalition which is going to not only win in Nevada, it's going to sweep this country.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. The polls, if anything, underestimated the size of a Bernie Sanders win in Nevada. We welcome now Emily Wilkins from our Washington Bureau for what we learned from Nevada. So what did we learn, Emily?
Well, David, Bernie Sanders was far and away the winner here. You saw all the other candidates basically split what was the moderate vote, and you saw Sanders really come in very strong, setting him up for a potentially strong showing in both South Carolina and the Super Tuesday primaries.
And we're going to talk about South Carolina Super Tuesday in a minute, but just pause for a moment on the Hispanic or Latino vote in Nevada, because it was a substantial part of the vote, as I understand it. Does this demonstrate something to us about Bernie Sanders' ability to reach out at least to Latinos?
Absolutely. I mean, when you hear Democrats talk about their party and their campaign, they talk about being a big tent. They talk about the need to make sure they're not only getting white voters, but also Latino voters, black voters, voters from across the spectrum. And here you saw Sanders do very well with Latinos. And I think a lot of people are looking forward to South Carolina to see how he does with black voters. That's a demographic that initially was very strongly in favor of Joe Biden. However, recent polls show that his lead there is slipping.
Okay, many thanks to Emily Wilkins of Bloomberg Government reporting today from Washington. We turn now from the Nevada past to the South Carolina future with our political panel of James Dickey. He is chairman of the Texas Republican Party, coming to us today from Austin. And here in New York, our Bloomberg political contributor, Jeannie Zaino of Iona College and Applied Economics. Jeannie, I'll pick on you first. As we look forward to South Carolina, there was a time we thought Joe Biden really had almost a prohibitive lead. Doesn't look like that anymore. If Bernie Sanders can win in South Carolina or even take a strong second, is he stoppable?
I think if Bernie Sanders even gets a strong second in South Carolina, that gives him so much momentum for 3 days later as we get into Super Tuesday. And we're focusing a lot, I think, on the debate tomorrow night and then, of course, James Clyburn's endorsement on Wednesday. But as we saw in Nevada, those endorsements seem to mean less and less on the ground, where the culinary union was not endorsing, and yet the Latino vote, as you mentioned, many of them culinary workers, came out in overwhelming numbers for Bernie Sanders. So I think it's going to be critical, and we're seeing his campaign put a lot more resources, a lot in the air, a lot on the ground in South Carolina, where he did terribly in 2016, but may have a really strong showing in this primary.
So, James, there have been times that it sounded like the president sort of was rooting for Bernie Sanders to be his opponent because he said, I'd love to run against a socialist. Are you rooting for Bernie Sanders, or do you have some concerns about him as a possible opponent?
Well, as I've talked with the president's campaign and folks at the RNC, we've been universal that it really doesn't matter, frankly, sadly, which of the socialist policy advancing candidates the Democrats put forward. As you look on the debate stage, there is not an inch of difference between them. And sure, Bernie would save us a step because he admits he's a socialist, and he credits terrible failed socialist and communist countries, and he praises them. So that would save us a step. But I think the Democrat Party is well on their way to burning themselves down.
James, I'm sorry, I just have to really pause there for a moment. You really believe there's no difference between the moderate positions of some of the Democratic candidates and what Bernie Sanders is saying? For example, on Medicare for All, you don't think there's any difference between Medicare for All and an enhanced Affordable Care Act? There's no difference in your mind?
Well, every single Democrat candidate for president has admitted that they need to repeal and replace Obamacare. Now, they're not willing to frame it that way, but that is in fact what they're doing. They are admitting that the last giant government program they put forward was an utter, complete, total failure for average Americans. There are minor differences in what they're proposing as a replacement, but every one of them is proposing repealing and replacing with yet another bigger government program, which is a step towards socialism.
So, Jeannie, I'd like your thoughts here, because that program that Mr. Dickey says was such a failure and the Democrats are running away from it was the basis basically for them to win the House of Representatives in 2018, as I recall.
Yeah, absolutely. And if they are able to hold the House and make any gains in the Senate, it will be based on that. And, you know, I would suggest that if you look at the Democrats' positions, they don't all want to repeal and replace. They've been very clear. They want to keep the Obamacare Act and they want to make it better or enhance it, as you talked about, if they're in the moderate lane. If they're in the, you know, Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren lane, you know, I think there is a big difference between the moderates and the progressives, quite frankly, and it's about $50 trillion, or Bernie Sanders, who can't give us a cost. So there's huge differences among Democrats on health care, but what they all agree on is they want everybody to be covered either through Obamacare or through moving to a Medicare for all sort of pathway.
So, Mr. Dickey, I do want to take up one poll with you that shows that Bernie Sanders actually would do the best against President Trump in the state of Texas, albeit he would lose by 2 points. I want to be clear about that, but would do the best of any of the Democrat candidates out there so far. Does that square with how you understand the Texas voting public?
Absolutely not. In fact, what we're seeing on the ground is a ton of excitement on the Republican side, not on the Democrat side. And there are hard numbers to back that up. Democrats could only in this primary get 1,401 candidates in the entire state of Texas. For comparison, we on the Republican side have 3,106 candidates in our primary across the state. In early voting right now, even though the Democrats are the one with the high-profile presidential race, even though Sanders and a bunch of others have been here and were here, we're seeing more votes on the Republican side, substantially more votes in early voting on the Republican side than on the Democrat side. And we saw this in Fort Bend County in House District 28 just last month, where the Democrats from all over the country poured in $2 million, and almost every presidential candidate was there fighting for the Democrat candidate. And we took what had been an 8-point suburban win in 2018 and turned it into a 16-point pounding last month.
Okay, Jeannie, it sounds like he's pretty confident about the state of Texas. Where do you think Texas is?
I think Texas is still a red state, and I think it'll be a red state in 2020. I think we've seen with, you know, some advances there with Beto O'Rourke and others. Some people say it's moving purple. I think moving is the operative word. I don't think it's there yet. But I do think that that's why this is a race that's going to be decided in states like your home state of Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Florida, Ohio. And when you look there, that's why the establishment Democrats are really concerned about about Bernie Sanders because they fear a Democratic socialist agenda won't play well in those states where it matters. And that's what we heard Jim Clyburn saying over the weekend when he was on all the Sunday shows, saying this is a concern of the establishment. Democrats are going to have to battle that out in the next, few weeks at this point.
Yeah, next 10 days or so. Okay, many thanks now to our Bloomberg contributor, Jeannie Zaino, and also to James Dickey. He's the Texas GOP chairman, coming to us from Austin. Thank you, Mr. Dickey. Still ahead, we are keeping an eye on U.S. markets. Stocks are down more than 3% across the board. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and radio. I'm David Weston. We want to return now to the markets. U.S. stocks are sinking today amid mounting fears about the coronavirus. Bloomberg's Kaylee Lyons is here with more. So it is a really red day.
It is a severely red day. Right now, we're looking at all three major averages down by more than 3% for the NASDAQ, which, of course, is very tech heavy. We're down nearly 4%. This is the worst day for the majors since back in 2018. And there is a lot of conviction behind the selling. We're looking at above average volume. Usually, so far in 2020, on days that we're down, volume is lighter. That is not the case today. People are actively selling. And you're seeing how risk off the tone is confirmed when we look outside of equities. You have the 10-year yield now down 10 basis points. We're at 137. We are just, or 135 now. We are just, really just a few basis points away from a record low. So we are seeing that safe haven bid. You're seeing that play out in gold as well. Futures are up about 1.7. We're nearing $1,700 an ounce on gold. Just a few weeks ago, we were in the 1500s. This is a really, really swift and vicious flood out of equities and into safe haven assets.
Right now, it doesn't look like anyone is buying any dips at the moment at all. But tell us about healthcare insurance in particular that's been hit.
Yeah, it's interesting. You're seeing the usual virus suspects fall today, the likes of travel stocks, et cetera. But the second worst performer in the S&P 500 is Centene. You're also seeing the likes of Anthem, Cigna lower. And this really is all about Bernie Sanders winning in Nevada. The analysts are saying that the market maybe was underpricing the risk that Bernie Sanders is to this market. One analyst over at Cowen wrote in a note after he won in Nevada saying that not only is he solidifying his position, he could be a bigger threat to President Trump in the general election than the market appreciates. And of course, that's threatening for these names because Bernie is an advocate for Medicare for all. It would eliminate private insurance.
Yeah, and that's the thing you're starting to pick up on a little bit. People, as they look at Bernie Sanders, say maybe he'd be a stronger opponent to President Trump than we've given him credit for.
Well, especially when you look, he won in Nevada. It's showing that he can build a more diverse coalition of Democrats than maybe was previously thought.
Yeah, okay, many thanks to Kaylee Lyons on that report on the markets. We're going to keep coming back to the markets throughout this hour. In the meantime, up next, President Trump's national security advisor denies that intelligence points to the Russians trying to help President Trump in 2020. But it is more open to the possibility that they may be trying to help Bernie Sanders. We talk with election security expert Jamil Jaffer of George Mason Law. That's next on Bloomberg. From New York, this is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. I'm David Weston. For Bloomberg First Word News, we go now to Mark Crumpton.
David, Harvey Weinstein will remain behind bars until his sentencing on March 11th. After a New York jury found the former movie mogul guilty of rape today, the judge ordered that Weinstein be immediately sent to jail. He was handcuffed and led away by court officers. A jury convicted Weinstein of rape and a criminal sexual act, but acquitted him of the most serious charge of predatory sexual assault. The Supreme Court has agreed to hear a major religious rights case. The court will rule in a dispute over a Philadelphia Catholic agency that won't place foster children with same-sex couples. A federal appeals court said Philadelphia could enforce a city anti-discrimination law by requiring those groups to work with same-sex couples. Catholic Social Services says that being threatened the future of Catholic agencies around the country. The 2020 presidential election is still more than 8 months away, but Vice President Pence is already laying the groundwork for a 2024 run. The Vice President has his own political action committee. He also has been steadily expanding his travel as a surrogate for the president, with a focus on Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. The U.S. government began outlining its extradition case against Julian Assange in a London court today, saying he is a criminal who put many lives at risk. Officials want to try Assange on espionage charges over the 2010 publication of hundreds of thousands of secret military documents. Assange argues he was acting as a journalist entitled to First Amendment protection. Hundreds of his supporters demonstrated outside the courthouse. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Quick Take by Bloomberg, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thanks so much, Mark. Are they or aren't they? Last week, there were reports that U.S. intelligence officers had briefed members of Congress that the Russians were trying to interfere in the 2020 elections, supporting both Senator Bernie Sanders and President Trump. But President Trump's national security advisor, Robert O'Brien, told ABC yesterday that he'd seen no evidence of Russian support for the president.
I haven't seen any intelligence that that Russia is doing anything to attempt to get President Trump reelected.
We welcome now an expert on election security. Jamil Jaffer is founder of the National Security Institute at George Mason University Law School and also Senior Vice President of IronNet Cybersecurity. He comes to us today from San Francisco. So, Jamil, welcome back. Is it possible that Mr. O'Brien's right and also the briefer's right in this sense? There wasn't specific intelligence that, in fact, the Russians were doing this in order to get President Trump reelected, but, in fact, there is evidence they're interfering on the one hand, and there is evidence on the other hand that, in general, they like President Trump.
Well, look, I think, David, it's exactly right that we know the Russians are interfering. The Russians have been interfering in our elections since the last cycle, and they're clearly interested in causing discord in the American body politic. On top of that, you know, what we have heard from the newest reports, it suggests that what the intelligence briefer meant was that the Russians thought President Trump was somebody they could work with and might be approachable or accessible to them. So that might be where some of this confusion is coming from. We also see what's going on with Senator Sanders. And so what's really important here is that what's clear is the Russians are supporting both sides and really trying to create a problem within our system, trying to undermine the validity of our elections and our trust in our rule of law institutions.
And how are they doing that? Do we have a sense of that? Because as you and I have talked before, there are two different sorts of election security. One is actually tampering with the election process, that is how the votes get registered and recorded and reported. And on the other hand, sort of communication around the electoral process, misinformation, for example, just into the general echo table.
That's exactly right, David. Those two categories of election interference. What we're seeing primarily is what we've seen previously, which is this idea of them getting into the conversation and trying to manipulate the conversation so that there's a debate within the American body politic, not about the issues, but about the validity of the elections themselves, about the legitimacy of them and the like. Now, they can create additional doubt by trying to affect the actual votes, but I think they recognize that if they actually tried to change votes, that would be viewed, you know, essentially not necessarily an act of war, but a serious matter by the U.S., and we'd be forced to take action. So I don't think they're going to do that, although we need to protect against that. And what's important there, David, is it's important that the federal government and the states work closely together, as Chris Krebs from DHS has been saying, that they need to work together really to collectively defend against this threat from an outside power, Russia.
If the bigger threat in some respects is, in fact, simply they're interfering in the form of misinformation being given to potential voters, what can be done about that?
Well, look, in part, what we need to do is to spread positive information and correct information, right? So, you know, somebody once said that the best antidote for bad speech is more speech, not less speech. And so that's an important part of the conversation, is to correct what's being said. The media plays a role in that, but the parties need to play a role in that too. And, you know, right now, today, we're really carping at one another. And what's important is that we come together as a nation, recognize that the Russians are coming after us, and then ultimately bring everybody together to defend these elections and protect them collectively against this threat from outside.
How much of this is social media?
Well, you know, a lot of it is social media, right? A lot of it is sort of what happens there, where people get into these groups where they're focused on their own theory of the world, and they get that theory sort of validated over and over again, and they spiral down into these challenges. And so what we need to do is to elevate that conversation. That's partly responsible. The candidates are responsible for that too. You know, whether it's Senator Sanders or another member of the Democratic Party and President Trump, they need to elevate that conversation, have a conversation about the issues and not about sort of, you know, who did what to whom.
Do you see anyone out there right now who's taking a leadership role in a way that you think makes sense based on your expertise?
Well, you know, I think that we have seen some good work being done in the Senate Intelligence Committee in particular. We've seen the two leaders of that committee work together to identify the threat to the United States, call it out for what it is. On the flip side, if you look over at the House Intelligence Committee, that's been a lot more challenged between Congressman Schiff and Congressman Nunes. So, there's a debate going on in the American public about the validity of our elections. What we need to do is say, look, there's a threat coming from the outside. States need to work with the federal government. The federal government needs to work with industry, the internet industry, to identify this disinformation and allow them to take action against it, identify for them where it's coming from. And then ultimately, what we need to do is come together as a nation and say, look, there is a debate about politics. What the debate about is not about, though, is about whether the Russians are or not manipulating our elections. They are, and we need to stop that.
So we saw Mark Zuckerberg last week actually go to Brussels and call for more regulation of Facebook, his own company, in part because he wanted to reestablish a greater sense of trust on the part of users. Part of what he said is, define for us what the political speech is. Define for us what the rules are for that. Do you think that's a sensible approach? Is that something the government can do or should do?
Well, look, I think that's a hard thing to do. We've wrestled with what the meaning of free speech is in the Constitution for the better part of 200 years. It's easy, I think, for Mr. Zuckerberg to say that with Facebook having the dominant position today. Now, that being said, I think there is a role for the government to play, working collaboratively with industry to identify the threats coming from abroad and saying, look, these messages are not legitimate. These are not American messages. These are messages being brought up from abroad. Eliminate these accounts, take action against them. At the same time, you have to be very careful that we not get in the business of regulating speech. At the end of the day, the antidote for negative or problematic speech is more speech, not less.
Is it feasible, because you know the cyber world much better than I do, is it feasible to have a requirement, a federal requirement, that says you must disclose the source of the speech? Or at least if you can't identify it, have a flag up there that says, I don't know where this came from. It may have come from overseas, for example.
Well, I think that there's at least some level of knowledge about where some of this stuff is coming from, right? And the government has a lot of that knowledge because, unlike the private sector, the government actually lives in overseas systems identifying threats to the country, right? Whether they're from foreign nation states or terrorist actors and the like. And if they were able to take that classified information, share it in real time with industry to better defend against social media hacking or cybersecurity threats, that could be a real benefit. Now, the Department of Homeland Security is working on those efforts. The NSA, Cyber Command, is working on those efforts. But with the threat to our election, we need to do more of that now to really defend the nation against this threat in cyberspace.
Okay, Jamil, thank you so much for being with us again. That's Jamil Jaffer. He is George Mason Law National Security Institute founder, coming to us from San Francisco. Coming up here, we're going to get more on the Democratic race for president with Jim Messina. He's former campaign manager for President Obama. Plus, of course, we are watching the markets. Stocks are plunging on fears of the coronavirus. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and radio. I'm David Weston. We keep our eye on the markets because the equity markets are really selling off in the United States following a European sell-off earlier. You can see across all the indices, they're down more than 3%, most down with the NASDAQ. In the meantime, as we look over at bonds, the 10-year U.S. bond is really gaining there. Now you can see they're down 11 basis points, down to 136 now in the yield for the 10-year. Gold is up, approaching now $1,700, and the dollar index is slightly weaker there as the yen has strengthened today, unlike last week. The yen has strengthened, but the dollar is slightly weaker. We'll keep watching those markets carefully throughout the hour because they are clearly moving. In the meantime, let's come back to the United States and to the Democratic race for president. Bernie Sanders added to his lead with his resounding victory in Nevada on Saturday. And if the polls are any indication, he has the momentum going into South Carolina and then on to Super Tuesday. For some perspective on the race and the state of the Democratic Party, welcome now Jim Messina. He's former White House Deputy Chief of Staff to President Obama and the manager for President Obama's 2012 re-election campaign. He's coming to us today from San Francisco. Jim, thanks so much for joining us. You have said that you think that Bernie Sanders may be the worst candidate to go up against Donald Trump. Do you still feel that way, and if so, why?
Look, I think his general election vulnerabilities are difficult for him, right? He's proposed massive tax increases on health insurance. He wants to get rid of Obamacare, which provides a bunch of swing voters protections that they very much care about. I haven't said that he can't win, but I think of all the major candidates, he'd have the biggest struggle.
And as a practical matter, can he be stopped? I mean, what does he need to do in South Carolina, for example, with Joe Biden? Joe Biden had been, it looked like almost the prohibitive favorite in the polls until recently, and now it looks like Bernie Sanders is gaining on him.
Yeah, I think we got to pump the brakes on this Bernie has it sewn up thing. I mean, only 3% of delegates have voted here. Super Tuesday is another 38%. We'll know much more about the race after Super Tuesday. But this weekend, if Bernie Sanders can beat Joe Biden in South Carolina, South Carolina has always been the state that Joe Biden says is his firewall. His African-American support, coupled with his support with older voters, has always made him the favorite. And so, you know, if Bernie Sanders can pull the upset there, that would be a very difficult moment for the vice president, and it would start having people look for other candidates if you're in the anti-Bernie lane.
Well, and that raises the question exactly. I've always been told, I don't know if it's true, that you can't beat somebody with nobody in politics. So if it's not Joe Biden, who would it be? Who do you think might be able to actually stop Bernie Sanders if that's the goal?
Well, then I think you'd look to Michael Bloomberg. You would look to perhaps Elizabeth Warren. But those are the only candidates I think can actually put it together right now. And, you know, the other candidates are beginning to struggle. And if you're anti-Bernie, you've got to get some of these candidates out of the race, right? You just have too many anti-Bernie candidates splitting the vote. You saw that in Nevada very, very clearly with the vice president doing well. Amy Klobuchar, Tom Steyer, Mayor Pete, all those guys are splitting the anti-Bernie votes while Bernie has, you know, a third of the votes, and he's starting to rack up these wins because his third is solid and everyone else is splitting up the vote.
Michael Bloomberg, of course, is the founder and majority shareholder of Bloomberg LP, our parent company. I think by most views, he did not have a particularly strong outing in that first debate. We've got another debate tomorrow night. What does he need to do if he really wants to try to be the alternative to Bernie Sanders?
Well, unlike last debate, which was all about Michael Bloomberg, this debate's going to be all about Bernie Sanders. Everyone is going to come after him because it's in their best political interest to do that. Bloomberg has to have some better answers for the fairly obvious questions he's going to get on women's issues, on stop and frisk. You know, it's hard to do the first debate. These other candidates have done 9 other debates. And, you know, I think Bloomberg just needs to have a more steady debate where he lays out his vision of, 1, his record as mayor of New York, and 2, that he's the candidate that can beat Donald Trump. If he can stick to that and not spend the whole time on defense, I think he'll have a better moment. And, you know, David, people forget that in these Super Tuesday states, which we're under 2 weeks away from, he's drastically outspending everyone in these states. And so he just needs to right the ship a little bit, have a good debate. You know, one bad debate doesn't kill your candidacy. As you remember, in 2012, Obama had the worst first debate in American political history, righted the ship in the second debate, and beat Mitt Romney handily in the election. So, you know, people need to just watch Bloomberg. And I think, you know, if I'm Mayor Bloomberg, I'm going to take the fight to Bernie a little bit tomorrow night.
In the meantime, as you say, the critical question perhaps is somebody else going to drop out? Do you see any indication that any of the alternatives in the moderate lane are inclined to drop out?
Well, I don't see how Tom Steyer stays in this race very long, right? He spent drastic amounts of money in Nevada and got almost nothing for it. He spent a bunch of money in South Carolina, and we'll see how that does it for him. But if he can't move in South Carolina, I would think that Steyer would be the first one out of this race.
Is there an argument for Bernie Sanders that he is authentic? I think everyone agrees he's authentic. He generates real passion. He is something of a celebrity. He has an operation, Bernie Bros, as I guess they're called, that in fact he may be the alternative to Donald Trump. A lot of those attributes are ones that are attributed actually to President Trump.
Yeah, the argument for Bernie Sanders is that he can expand the electorate and he can get a bunch of people excited about politics, young voters, minorities, people who feel disenfranchised by the process, and get them to vote in an election where they don't usually vote. That's the argument for him. Interesting, in 2016, that's exactly what we saw. He brought real numbers of new voters into the process where he did much better against Hillary Clinton than everyone assumed he would. I think what you've seen so far, though, is less of a turnout than people expected in the early states, and less voters kind of coming and being excited by Senator Sanders' candidacy than I think his supporters would have expected. He's still doing really well because, again, he has his third of the Democratic Party who's showing up in all these things, and he's getting about a third to 40%, and that's enough to win these states. But so far, we haven't seen him expand the electorate in a way that he will need to win in November.
Jim, I wonder if you're perplexed at all, surprised by those turnout numbers, because some people, at least, were saying it's not so much that we're going to be so enthusiastic for somebody, we're very enthusiastic against someone, that is the President of the United States. And that will really generate a lot of passion on the Democrat side for just about anybody as an alternative to Donald Trump. Maybe we should revisit that assumption?
Well, it's interesting. In the 2019 off-year governor's elections in southern states like Kentucky and Louisiana, you saw the highest turnout that both parties had in over 50 years. In 2018, David, as you and I have talked about before, we had the highest midterm election turnout in 102 years. You're not seeing that in the Democratic primary. I think there's a couple of reasons for it, but it does kind of stand to make people think about, could Bernie Sanders really expand the electorate in the way he's claiming? Because so far we haven't seen that.
But we haven't seen it for anybody else either, have we?
No, you haven't seen it. I mean, you know, the New Hampshire numbers were better than 2016. They were approaching 2008, but Iowa numbers and Nevada numbers weren't a big explosion in turnout. I think better numbers will be Super Tuesday when you have 40% of voters voting, and that's almost a national primary, considering that California and Texas are now at Super Tuesday for the first time. So I think we'll have a better judge of that after Super Tuesday.
Okay, Jim, really always a treat to have you with us. Thank you so much for your time. That is former White House Deputy Chief of Staff. He's Jim Messina. And coming up here, U.S. stocks fall on the pace for their worst day in more than 2 years now, while fears of the coronavirus are suddenly gripping Wall Street. That's coming up next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. I'm David Weston. U.S. stocks are plunging today alongside markets in Europe and Asia as the coronavirus continues to spread more widely outside China and fears grow. For more, let's bring back now Bloomberg's Abigail Doolittle. So it doesn't look any better than the last time I talked to you.
It certainly doesn't. And from the last time we did speak, just about half an hour ago, stocks actually made new lows, at one point on pace for the worst day in 2 years since February of 2018. So the sellers are really not relenting at all as this fear now grips the market that this coronavirus could really dent the global economy, economic growth, and perhaps it will extend beyond a quarter or two. Maybe we will see more companies similar to Apple having to revise their views down. It's that unknown factor at this point. There was such a period of time, a long period of time, where folks were comparing it to SARS and thinking it was somewhat contained. But as you were saying earlier in the hour, we just don't know. There's a lot of uncertainty here.
Yeah, and you and I have talked about that at various times, why the markets actually were doing so well, considering that we don't know. But talking about global, for example, it started with Asia, but then Europe really got hit on the equities before we got to the United States. And this is a continuation of what we watched over the last 24 hours.
Yes, well, one of the market experts that we talk to frequently on charting futures and smart charts, Eric Dugan of 3D Capital Markets, he talks about the global relay race and that it always starts in Asia. So Asia was mixed, but the Kospi index in particular, the Korea index, it was down nearly 4%, the worst day since 2018. And of course, the virus is really spreading in Korea, causing a large quarantine there. The fears spread to Europe, down 4%, the worst day since 2016. At that point, we have bonds here in the U.S. on pace for the best day since 2016. Speaking of bonds, we have the 10-year yield almost about to make a new record low. That's the degree of the fear and the uncertainty.
And as you suggest, whether it's a Kospi or whether it's in Europe, there could be a double effect here. Because Kospi often you look at about trade, it's a surrogate for trade, we're worried about the global growth in trade, but they also have coronavirus in Korea. And in Europe, on the one hand, you're worried about what that does, the problems with China, with what happens in the European economy, but they have it in North Italy. So it's hard to determine how much of it is actually a direct effect of what's going on as opposed to the markets.
Well, as you're saying this, David, the other thought that comes to me is if it does come here to the U.S., because for the most part here in the U.S. it's been isolated, but this idea that it really is concentrated in Asia, there is some now in the Middle East and in Europe, and if it were to come to the U.S., there could really be a greater issue in terms of the effect on the corporate profit outlook. Last Friday, of course, we had that very weak market PMI, the worst since 2013, I believe, as services plunged. So it's clear that there's already an effect here. But if this tragedy were to spread here, it could hit the corporate profit outlook even more. And I think that is probably a worry that some investors are reckoning with today.
And if you look at sector by sector, energy, obviously, oil's getting killed. Financials, you just mentioned the 10-year yield, and banks don't usually do very well on that. FANGs, the tech sector, really getting hard. So if you look at sector by sector, some of the ones that could be leading on the upside are really getting hit the hardest.
Yeah, it's brutal in terms of the degree of selling. It's one of those moments you often hear traders talk about, the idea when the music stops, will you have a chair? And it's that sort of rush for the exits here that we're seeing where traders and investors are just selling indiscriminately. And we were just taking a look at the IMAP and we see all of that red on the screen. Something else that I think is worth taking a look at that in the Bloomberg terminal, we've been tracking all the different asset classes since the beginning of the outbreak of the coronavirus. And not surprisingly, right from the start, the risk assets did very poorly, including oil and copper, the Dow Transports, the Shanghai Composite. However, last week or even a week before, the S&P 500 at one point was beating bonds. That's the degree of blinders that investors had on, not really factoring that this could really play in. But now bonds are up top. The S&P 500, interestingly, down about 2%, actually worse than the Shanghai Composite, which is sort of a strange twist. Hard to explain. Maybe, again, the fear that we have not seen the worst yet here in the U.S.
Who has a hard job tomorrow is Rich Clarida, the vice chair of the Fed, who is appearing at the NABE conference because people are going to look into the Fed to see, is there anything you can do to help us here?
Agreed. And when you had your exclusive interview with him not so long ago, he was saying if this extends beyond a quarter or two, it could affect policy.
Exactly. Okay. Thank you so much to Abigail Dillard for keeping us abreast of the markets. Coming up, Balance of Power continues on Bloomberg Radio. We're going to have more coverage of the market sell-off as virus fears continue to grow. Plus, an interview with the head of the Port of Los Angeles. We'll find out how the virus is affecting shipments into his port in Los Angeles. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio.